In this chapter on the law, we're going to be looking at how the law impacts different groups of people and how it creates different outcomes. We think of the law as neutral, but it's not. As I said, the law is not neutral. It can maintain bias. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's subtle, but there's biases towards different groups. It's also not neutral in its application. It's applied by people who at worst harbor prejudice and at the least may have an internal, more subtle implicit bias. We'll look at both the basic concept of how the laws are supposed to work, from the theoretical perspective, what they're supposed to do to achieve for society, but we'll also look at the disparate outcomes that the law creates through its application by people. Those people have biases, and we carry those biases around within our thinking process. What is it that the law is supposed to do for society? In theory, our laws are a representation of its people's values. It's an instrument to keep the peace and the orderliness of society. It allocates resources, and it speaks to what people's rights and responsibilities are to each other and to society as a whole. It's shaped by the needs of the people, and their concerns at the time the laws are drafted should be reflected by the laws. If you think about our own Constitution, and for instance the Second and Third Amendments, you can imagine the concern of the framers of our Constitution. The Second Amendment was drafted so that the people had the right to bear arms in order to protect themselves from the British soldiers that were trying to maintain Britain's rule in the New World. Or the Third Amendment, that was drafted to protect the people from having to house the British soldiers in their homes. We don't think of those laws the same way today because society is distinctly different than it was 250 years ago. But we all know that there can be consequences for breaking the law. But where does that authority come from? Most of the basic ideas that written laws come from are from our social norms and basic values. Remember that we've talked about ideologies being the basis for justifying some of our laws. The broadly based ideas that society has generally forms the agreement that becomes a body of our laws. So laws can be derived from federal and state constitutions, and they of course are interpreted by the federal and state Supreme Courts. They're written by the legislature, and then they're binding on the citizens. Our laws are then enforced in different ways. Consequences for breaking the laws can include fines, imprisonment, or even death. Oftentimes, there's disagreements about what the laws should be, or if they've been drafted and enacted, whether they should even be enforced. Think about the issue that arose regarding gay marriage. While the United States Supreme Court stated that all states must honor gay marriage in 2015, Kentucky's Rowan County clerk refused to give a marriage license to a gay couple that wanted to get married. She then went to jail for being in contempt of court when the federal court stated she had to give the couple a marriage license. You can see the value issue here. The Rowan County clerk stated her religion did not allow her to recognize gay marriage, while the U.S. Supreme Court, which was the highest court in the land, said she must process the marriage license. The law has several important functions. It allows for both informal and formal social control. When we talk about social control, we're talking in broad terms, and we're speaking to how society regulates or moderates both the individual's actions as well as the collective actions of all people in society. Informal social controls are the unwritten rules of society, things like accepted customs. So, for example, if you walked into a job interview and the person extended their hand to shake yours, you would know that you should reach forward and reciprocate. Or another example, opening doors for people who are carrying bags. If you fail to do so, you might be thought of as selfish or rude. Formal social controls, on the other hand, are those that are codified by society, meaning they're written down somewhere. There's a process by which they're adopted, which is a formal process. If you violate formal social controls, there's a predetermined sanction or a range of sanctions. Those sanctions could include a fine, jail time, or even capital punishment if the crime was severe enough. The idea is that the punishment will be severe enough to stop the behavior from happening, or at least it should be enough of a deterrent that most people will not engage in the behavior. This issue of punishment as deterrent is important to understand, in that it clearly does not always work. Whether a deterrent works or not depends not only on the type of punishment that could be imposed, but also whether the individual who is going to engage in the act sees the punishment as an actual threat. For the most part, deterrence generally has to have three factors in place to be effective. The law must be severe enough to create an incentive not to engage in the behavior. There has to be certainty that it will be imposed, and it has to be delivered with some aspect of speed. It can't be imposed long after the offense has been committed. These are the general aspects of the law that usually have to be in place for laws to be effective in prohibiting most behaviors.